Winds of the sea, storms of destiny. The Atlantic winds have always been messengers. For centuries, they carried two things across the vast, indifferent expanse of the ocean: the sharp, stinging taste of salt, and the silent, intoxicating promise of distant horizons. They were the engines of empire, the couriers of trade, the unseen hands that pushed sails toward new worlds, new fortunes, and new forms of despair. They whispered of continents yet to be charted, of wealth beyond imagining, and of the profound, terrifying freedom that lay just beyond the curve of the earth. To the sailors who harnessed them, the merchants who profited from them, and the captives who were carried by them against their will, these winds were not merely weather. They were the breath of destiny itself. Nowhere was this truth felt more acutely than in the Caribbean archipelago. And on the small island of Nevis, a lonely, verdant speck adrift in the turquoise sea, the wind was a constant, living presence. It was a force that shaped not just the landscape, but the very character of life. It rattled the wooden shutters of the merchants' houses in Charlestown, a percussive rhythm against the heat of the day. It bent the tall, slender palm trees toward the earth, making them bow in a constant, graceful submission. In the skies above, it sent the gulls screaming and wheeling over the crashing surf, their cries a raw counterpoint to the endless sigh of the waves. Nevis was a paradox, a place of staggering beauty and breathtaking cruelty existing in the same frame. It was a paradise forged in the fires of a commercial hell. From the peak of its central mountain, a dormant volcano shrouded in mist, one could see the emerald slopes cascading down to beaches of fine white sand. But this idyllic scenery was scarred by the geometric precision of the sugar plantations. They sprawled across the hills like immense, intricate chessboards, where the game being played was for fortunes in sugar, rum, and human lives. On this board, the pieces were black slaves, toiling under a sun that bleached the very sky, and the players were white overseers and distant English owners. Wealth was harvested here, stalk by bloody stalk, and just as quickly, it could be lost. A drought could wither the cane, a blight could poison the crop, and a hurricane, the ultimate arbiter of Caribbean fate, could erase a generation of profit in a single roaring night. It was into this world of intense contrasts, of sun and shadow, wealth and misery, that Alexander Hamilton was born. He entered the world in a modest house near the wharf, a place where the air was thick with the smells of the harbor salt, fish, molasses, and the damp rot of wooden hulls. His first breaths were filled with the sounds of the port, the creak of rigging, the shouts of sailors in a dozen different languages, the rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer. The exact date of his birth remains a small mystery, a footnote of uncertainty at the very beginning of a life that would be defined by meticulous detail. It was the 11th of January, but the year was either 1757 or perhaps 1755. Even history, it seems, could not quite pin him down from the start. His origins were shrouded not just in ambiguity, but in scandal. His mother, Rachel Fawcett, was a woman of defiant spirit and tragic circumstances. Trapped in an abusive marriage to an older man, she had done the unthinkable. She had left him. In the rigid social structure of the colonial Caribbean, this was an act of profound rebellion. Her defiance led her to James Hamilton, a wandering Scotsman, the fourth son of a laird, who possessed the aristocratic name but none of the accompanying fortune. He had charm enough to win her heart, a handsome face, and a way with words that promised a life less ordinary. But his charm was not matched by substance or stability. He was a dreamer, a drifter, a man forever seeking a fortune that remained just over the horizon. For a few brief years, Rachel and James carved out a life together, unsanctioned by the church, and looked down upon by the island's polite society. They had two sons, James Jr. and Alexander. But the same winds that had carried James Hamilton to Nevis eventually beckoned him away again. He was a man, it turned out, who was better at beginnings than endings. Citing a need to spare Rachel the humiliation of a bigamy charge from her first husband, but more likely fleeing from the crushing reality of his own failures, he vanished. He sailed away, leaving Rachel with 2 young sons, a mountain of debts she could not possibly pay, and a future as fragile and uncertain as a ship in a storm. Alexander's childhood was not a single, dramatic tragedy. It was something more insidious, a slow, grinding education in the realities of poverty and social exclusion. He was the illegitimate son of a failed merchant, a boy with a brilliant mind but no name, no money, and no clear path forward. After his mother died of a fever when he was just a boy, he and his brother were briefly taken in by a cousin, who then died by suicide. The Hamilton boys were left truly orphaned, their few possessions sold at auction. Alexander was scattered by the winds of fate. He found his refuge and his prison in a counting house. Before he had a chance to truly explore the wild green hills of his island home, he was thrust into the world of commerce. He was apprenticed to the firm of Beekman and Kruger New York traders with a branch in Christiansted. There, his world shrank to the size of a ledger book. He learned the precise, elegant script of a clerk. He learned the complex arithmetic of currency exchange, the cold logic of profit and loss. He learned the smells that defined his existence, the cloying sweetness of raw sugar, the sharp, metallic scent of ink, the musty odor of paper and canvas sails. He lived in a world of numbers, of accounts, of figures that represented vast sums of money and the movements of ships across the globe. He tracked fortunes for merchants who trusted figures far more than they trusted the faces of the men who worked for them. It was a suffocating existence for a boy with a restless, hungry mind. And so, he created an escape. He read. He read with a ferocity born of desperation. He devoured any book he could get his hands on, borrowing them from a local minister, snatching precious moments to read between logging shipments of molasses and calculating interest on a debt. He journeyed through the pages of Daniel Defoe, finding a kinship with the resourcefulness of Robinson Crusoe on his own island. He walked with the heroes of ancient Greece and Rome through the writings of Plutarch, learning of men who shaped empires through intellect and will. He absorbed the poetic grandeur of the Bible and the dramatic fatalism of Greek tragedies. He would study late into the night, the pages illuminated by the flickering, greasy light of a whale oil lamp, reading until his eyes burned and the letters blurred together. And he wrote. Writing was not just a pastime, it was an assertion of self, a way to impose order on the chaos of his life and the world around him. He wrote long, eloquent letters to his friends, filled with philosophical musings and sharp observations. He wrote essays on subjects no one had asked him to consider. He penned vivid descriptions of the bustling market, the elegant lines of a newly arrived ship, the ominous darkening of the sky before a storm. His writing was his true self, a voice that was sophisticated, analytical, and already straining against the confines of his small world. The island was small enough that such a talent could not go unnoticed. The merchants and planters, men of practical affairs, saw something in the intense, serious clerk. They saw a mind that moved with a speed and precision that was startling. One of them was said to have remarked, with a mixture of awe and perhaps a little fear, "That boy has the ambition of a whole city stuffed into him." They saw his hunger, his relentless drive. What they didn't know was that this ambition was about to be unleashed by a force of nature even greater than his own will. In August of 1772, the hurricane came. It was not a typical storm. This was a monster, a vortex of divine rage that roared out of the heart of the Atlantic. It tore a path of utter devastation across the Leeward Islands, a physical manifestation of the biblical apocalypse. The sky turned a sickening shade of green-gray. The wind began to shriek. a sound that rose from a moan to a high-pitched demonic scream. It was a wind that didn't just blow, it clawed and ripped and tore. It leveled houses as if they were made of paper, their wooden beams snapping like twigs. It stripped the lush fields bare, leaving behind a wasteland of mud and splintered cane stalks. It lifted ships from their moorings in the harbor and drove them onto the reefs, smashing them to pieces like toys discarded by a colossal, careless child. Hamilton, now a teenager of 15 or 17, but with the old, weary eyes of a man who had seen too much, watched the storm rip the world open. He was no longer just an observer of life. He was a survivor. When the winds finally, mercifully died down, an eerie, stunned silence descended upon the ruined island. The air was hot, thick, with the smell of salt water and decay. In the midst of this devastation, while others were weeping or praying or simply staring in shock, Hamilton sat down and did the one thing that gave him power. He wrote a long, detailed letter to his father, a man he barely knew. But this was no simple account of survival, no prayerful thank you to God for being spared. It was a masterpiece of literary journalism, a furious, vivid, and terrifyingly eloquent description of the apocalypse he had just witnessed. His prose was muscular, his imagery stark. He painted a picture of nature in a state of total rebellion against mankind. It seemed as if a total dissolution of nature was taking place, he wrote, his words capturing the sheer elemental horror of the event. He described the sea rising up to swallow the streets, the air so thick with flying sand and shattered roof shingles that it was impossible to breathe. He wrote of the church steeple, a symbol of faith and stability, crashing down into the town square like the fall of heaven itself. The letter was so powerful, so extraordinary, that a local minister, Hugh Knox, urged him to publish it. It appeared in the Royal Danish American Gazette. The effect was electric. People across the islands read it in sheer astonishment. Who was this boy? Who was this young clerk who wrote with the power and wisdom of a man twice his age, who could capture both the terror and the sublime, terrible beauty of the storm in the very same sentence? The paper was passed from one calloused hand to another among the island's merchants and community leaders. They read it, and they understood. This boy's mind was a force of nature in its own right, as powerful as the hurricane he had just described. To keep him here, to confine him to a counting desk, would be a sin against potential itself. It would be like trying to bottle a storm, and so they began to gather money. A scholarship fund was created. They pooled their resources, a collective investment in a future they could only guess at, but one they knew would be significant. They raised enough to send the boy away from their small, shattered island, to send him to the vast mainland of North America, to a world they hoped would be big enough to contain his mind. Let him leave, was the consensus. Let him learn. He belongs to history, not to a counting desk. And so, in the autumn of 1772, Alexander Hamilton boarded a ship bound for Boston, and then New York. He left behind the only world he had ever known, the sun, the sea, the ledgers, the ghosts of his past. He carried with him very little, a few letters of introduction to influential men, the clothes on his back, and a head so full of ambition, knowledge, and relentless energy that it must have felt like a physical weight. The boy forged in the crucible of island hardship and honed by a hurricane was now sailing toward a new world, a continent that was itself rumbling with the winds of a gathering storm, the storm of revolution. He had no intention of merely witnessing it. He intended to master it. The years of revolution. When Alexander Hamilton's ship sailed into New York Harbor in the late autumn of 1772, the city that greeted him was a chaotic, vibrant, and utterly alien world. New York then was not the gleaming metropolis it would one day become. It was a bustling, jostling port town of some 20,000 souls, a crowded knot of humanity clinging to the southern tip of Manhattan Island. It was a city of stark contrasts and palpable energy. The air itself was a thick brew of smells he had never encountered in such concentration. The familiar scent of salt water and tar, but mixed with the pungent odor of horse manure on cobblestone streets, the comforting aroma of baking bread, and the acrid smoke of countless chimneys. It was a city of 100 different languages, a cacophony of dialects that echoed in the narrow streets. There were stern-faced Dutch merchants whose ancestors had founded the city, their presence still felt in the gabled architecture. There were English officials, soldiers and loyalists, the confident representatives of a distant king. There were sailors from every corner of the Atlantic world, their faces weathered by sun and sea. And there were the silent, unwilling participants in this colonial experiment. The African slaves whose labor built and sustained the city's prosperity. For a boy from the sleepy, sun-drenched Isle of Nevis, the sheer density and velocity of New York must have been both exhilarating and overwhelming. Hamilton did not waste time. Armed with letters of introduction from his patrons in the Caribbean, he enrolled first in a preparatory academy in New Jersey, and then, in 1773, gained admission to King's College, the institution that would one day become Columbia University. He threw himself into his studies with the same obsessive intensity he had applied to the merchants' ledgers and Plutarch's heroes. He was a whirlwind of intellectual activity. He demonstrated a remarkable facility with languages, a near-supernatural quickness with numbers and complex mathematics, and, most notably, a breathtaking speed in forming and articulating his opinions. But the curriculum at King's College was not the only education he was receiving. The college itself was a microcosm of the larger political storm brewing across the 13 colonies. The air over America in the 1,770 seconds was stretched taut, like a wire pulled to its breaking point. Every new tax from Parliament, every inflammatory speech in Boston, every shipment of tea left to rot in a harbor added to the unbearable tension. In the taverns and coffee houses of New York, men argued passionately over concepts that were becoming matters of life and death: liberty, loyalty, representation, and tyranny. The streets were littered with pamphlets, cheap, quickly printed essays that flew from hand to hand like angry birds, carrying arguments for and against the crown. For a young man like Hamilton, who had spent his life fighting his way out of obscurity, this was not a debate to be observed from the sidelines. This was an arena. He found his voice, and he discovered that it was a powerful weapon. He began to write. He penned anonymous pamphlets, defending the colonial cause against the increasingly heavy-handed policies of the British government. He attacked prominent loyalist writers with sentences so sharp, so precisely aimed, that they left intellectual and political scars. His logic was incisive, his prose was fiery, and his arguments were rooted in a deep reading of political philosophy that astounded his peers. He soon moved from the printed page to the public square. When mobs clashed in the streets over the hated tea tax or the latest parliamentary decree, Hamilton was not afraid to step into the fray. He would climb onto barrels or crates, his small, lean frame making him seem an unlikely orator. But when he spoke, all doubts vanished. His voice, clear and strong, cut through the noise of the crowd. He spoke with a passion and a logical force that commanded attention. One witness to these impromptu speeches later wrote, with a sense of wonder, "The young man speaks like he's been waiting his whole life for an audience." He had. The lonely boy who read by candlelight in a Caribbean counting house had found his stage. The clerk who once wrote essays no one asked him for now had a whole city, a whole continent, listening. He was no longer just a student. He was a voice of the coming revolution. By 1775, the whispers of rebellion had escalated into the deafening crack of muskets on the village green at Lexington, and the bridge at Concord. British redcoats, sent to seize a cache of colonial weapons, had been met with armed resistance. Blood had been shed. The war for independence, once a theoretical possibility debated in pamphlets, had begun. For Hamilton, there was no question of which side he was on. The abstract ideals of liberty he had written about now demanded a physical commitment. He, along with other students from King's College, formed a volunteer militia company. They called themselves the Hearts of Oak. They were a motley crew, drilling in the quiet churchyards of the city, their youthful enthusiasm far outstripping their military expertise. They wore mismatched coats and carried old, borrowed muskets. Their prized possession was a single old cannon, a relic that was known to make more noise than it delivered accuracy. They were learning the steps to a deadly dance that no one had ever taught them, but they learned with astonishing speed. Hamilton, in particular, approached the art of war as he approached everything else, as a problem to be systematically mastered. He threw himself into the study of military science. While other students might have been reading poetry, Hamilton was poring over gunnery manuals by candlelight, memorizing the complex mathematics of trajectories, the precise chemistry of gunpowder, and the optimal lengths for cannon fuses. He understood that battles were won not just with courage, but with logistics, with the brutal, grinding work of moving heavy cannons through mud and over rough terrain, all while under the threat of enemy fire. His theoretical knowledge was soon put to the test. By the summer of 1775, he had been appointed captain of the New York Provincial Company of Artillery, commanding a unit of 60 men and their cannons. When British warships sailed menacingly into New York Harbor, their rows of gun ports like bared teeth, their polished cannons glinting in the sun, Hamilton's company was waiting for them. They manned the batteries on the shore, at the very edge of the river. Under Hamilton's cool direction, they loaded and fired, their cannons bucking and roaring, sending plumes of thick white smoke billowing out over the water. They held their line even as British cannonballs smashed into the houses and fortifications around them, sending splinters of wood flying through the air. In the crucible of combat, the scholar with the quill pen had been forged into something new. Here was a soldier, lean, tireless, and utterly composed in the face of chaos, a young man already commanding the deep respect of men who were twice his age. In March of 1776, as the British military machine began to tighten its grip on New York, a figure of immense gravity and authority rode into the city. General George Washington, newly appointed by the Continental Congress as the commander-in-chief of the fledgling Continental Army, had arrived to take command. Washington was everything Hamilton was not. He was tall, physically imposing, and famously reserved. He was a man who measured his words carefully before speaking, whose silence often carried more weight and authority than other men's most eloquent speeches. Hamilton, by contrast, was all restless energy, a torrent of words and ideas, a young man whose ambition burned with a visible fire. They were opposites in temperament, a study in contrast, the stoic Virginia planter and the fiery Caribbean orphan. Yet a great leader recognizes talent, even when it comes in an unfamiliar form. During the chaotic Battle of Harlem Heights, a rare American success in the disastrous New York campaign, Washington had the opportunity to observe the young artillery captain in action. He watched as Hamilton, amidst the deafening roar of cannon fire and the panic of retreating soldiers, directed the fire of his cannons with an icy precision. While others panicked or scattered under the intense British bombardment, Hamilton shouted orders, repositioned his men, and remained a point of absolute calm and control in the heart of the storm. Washington saw more than just raw courage. He saw a superior mind at work, the rare and invaluable ability to think clearly and strategically under the most extreme pressure. A few months later, Washington summoned Hamilton to his headquarters. The general's offer was direct. He needed a man of Hamilton's abilities, not on the front lines firing cannons, but at his side, in the very nerve center of the war. He offered Hamilton a position as his aide-de-camp. For many ambitious young officers, this would have been a disappointment, a move away from the battlefield and the path to martial glory. But Hamilton understood immediately what it truly was. It was an offer of proximity to power, to strategy, to the unfolding of history itself. He accepted without hesitation. As 1,776 bled into the desperate winter of 1,777, Hamilton rode at Washington's side, a constant presence through the darkest days of the Revolution. He was there during the humiliating retreats across New Jersey, with the British Army nipping at their heels. He endured the brutal winter encampments, where the cause of independence seemed to be freezing to death along with the starving, shoeless soldiers. He witnessed nights when the entire revolution seemed just one more lost battle, one more mass desertion, away from total extinction. In his new role, Hamilton became Washington's indispensable right hand. He was more than a secretary. He was the general's pen, his voice, and often his shadow mind. He drafted Washington's voluminous correspondence, translating the general's thoughts into elegant, forceful prose. He wrote the daily orders that kept the army moving. He argued with a stubborn and often inept Continental Congress, pleading and demanding the supplies food, clothing, gunpowder that the army desperately needed to survive. He managed intelligence, debriefing spies, and analyzing enemy movements. He became, in effect, an apprentice in the art of nation building, learning firsthand how a nation could be forged and held together even as it was fighting for the mere right to be born. The boy from the island had finally reached the mainland of history. The counting house clerk was now at the epicenter of a world-changing war. He had come farther than anyone could have imagined. And as he looked ahead at the immense, daunting task of winning a war and then building a country from scratch, Alexander Hamilton had no intention of leaving his mark on it quietly. His war and his work had only just begun, building a nation. The surrender of General Cornwallis at Yorktown in 1781 was not an end, but a beginning. The deafening roar of the cannons faded, replaced by the uneasy quiet of a victory that felt, to many, as precarious as the peace that followed. The United States of America was free. But what precisely was the United States of America? As the British troops marched out under their white flags, their drums beating the funereal tune, the world turned upside down. Hamilton, now a decorated war hero of 24, watched in thoughtful silence. He understood, with a clarity that eluded many of his contemporaries, that the war for independence was over, but the far more difficult war to build a nation was about to begin. Freedom had been won on the battlefield, but the architecture of that freedom had yet to be designed. The nation that existed in 1783 was a nation in name only. It was less a unified country and more a loose, quarrelsome confederation of 13 independent states, each fiercely jealous of its own sovereignty. They behaved like 13 small, bickering kingdoms. There were 13 different currencies, creating a chaos of exchange rates that crippled commerce. There were 13 separate state militias, but no credible national army. And there were 13 competing sets of interests, with tidewater planters, New England merchants, and frontier farmers viewing each other with deep suspicion. The governing document, the Articles of Confederation, was a testament to the deep-seated fear of centralized power that had fueled the revolution. It created a national government so weak, it was practically paralyzed. The Congress under the Articles could not levy taxes directly. It could only request funds from the states, which they often ignored. It could barely raise enough money to pay for its own postage, let alone the massive war debts owed to soldiers and foreign allies. Soldiers who had bled for the cause still clutched worthless war bonds instead of the pay they had been promised. The government could not regulate interstate commerce, leading to petty trade wars between neighboring states. New York placed taxes on firewood from Connecticut and cheese from New Jersey, treating them like foreign nations. Virginia and Maryland quarreled bitterly over navigation rights on the Potomac River. Hamilton watched this slow-motion disintegration with growing alarm. He saw chaos brewing just beneath the surface of the victory parades and patriotic speeches. The glorious revolution, he feared, was curdling into anarchy. A republic without order, without a strong, unifying structure, was, he wrote, like a ship adrift on the ocean without a wind, a rudder, or a compass. It was destined to be dashed upon the rocks. His first opportunity to address this crisis came in 1786. A meeting was convened in Annapolis, Maryland, ostensibly to discuss the crippling trade barriers that were strangling the national economy. The turnout was pathetic. Only 5 of the 13 states bothered to send delegates. Most politicians and leaders, weary from the long war, simply yawned at the prospect of another tedious convention. Hamilton did not. He saw the poorly attended meeting not as a failure, but as an opening. He rose to speak before the half-empty hall, his voice ringing with an urgency that commanded the attention of the few who were present. He argued that the delegates were focusing on the symptoms, not the disease. The real problem was not the trade disputes. It was the fundamental weakness of the national government under the Articles of Confederation. The states were acting not as partners in a common enterprise, but as rivals in a zero-sum game. What they needed, he declared, was a government with the power to unite them, to enforce laws, to pay its debts, and to command respect on the world stage. Without that, their hard-won independence would rot from within, collapsing into factionalism and civil strife. He did more than just speak. He acted. He drafted a resolution, a bold and audacious proposal that called for a new convention, a gathering of delegates from all the states to meet in Philadelphia the following year. Their purpose would not be to merely tinker with the existing articles, but to undertake a wholesale revision, to devise such further provisions as shall appear to them necessary to render the Constitution of the federal government adequate to the exigencies of the Union. Few in the room realized the monumental significance of that moment. Hamilton had just lit the fuse that would lead directly to the creation of the United States Constitution. The summer of 1,787 inches Philadelphia was suffocatingly hot. Behind the closed doors and shuttered windows of the Pennsylvania State House, sworn to secrecy, 55 delegates from 12 states, Rhode Island refused to attend, gathered to debate the future of the nation. The atmosphere was thick with heat, humidity, and the immense, crushing weight of their task. Presiding over the convention was the one man who commanded universal respect, George Washington. His silent, imposing authority lent a vital gravity to the proceedings. The intellectual powerhouse was James Madison of Virginia, who had come meticulously prepared, and whose diligent notes would provide the most complete record of the debates. And then there was the aged and wise Benjamin Franklin, using his wit and humor to soothe frayed tempers and bridge ideological divides. Hamilton, a delegate from New York, was initially quiet. He listened and watched as factions began to form and clash. Delegates from large states argued with those from small states over the nature of representation. Southern delegates fought to protect the institution of slavery, while some Northerners voiced their opposition. There were fierce debates over the powers of the presidency, the structure of the courts, and the fundamental question of how to balance the power of a central government with the rights of the states. Some delegates, like Patrick Henry, feared any government that was stronger than the one they had just overthrown. They wanted a weak, limited federal government, one that was barely more powerful than the existing Articles of Confederation. They saw the specter of tyranny in every proposal to grant the government the power to tax or to raise a standing army. Hamilton grew impatient with what he saw as paralyzing fear and short-sightedness. When he finally rose to speak on the 18th of June, he did not hold back. He delivered a marathon speech that lasted for 5 or perhaps 6 straight hours. It was a brilliant, exhaustive, and deeply controversial tour de force. He laid out his own vision for the American Republic, a vision that was far more centralized and powerful than what most delegates were prepared to accept. He called for a strong, energetic executive, a president who would be elected for life on the basis of good behavior. He proposed a Senate whose members would also serve for life to provide a stable, aristocratic check on the passions of the more democratic House of Representatives. He argued, above all, for a federal government with clear and undisputed power over the individual states. He warned the delegates that liberty without structure was a recipe for suicide. He argued that a government that was too weak to act, too afraid to govern, would inevitably fail, leaving a vacuum to be filled by chaos. And from that chaos, he declared, would arise either the tyranny of the mob or the tyranny of a monarch by another name. His speech was a stunning performance, a testament to his intellectual firepower. But for many of the delegates, it was simply too extreme, too close to the British model they had just fought a war to escape. Some nodded in quiet agreement with his stark logic, but most were shocked by his proposals. Though his specific plan was rejected, Hamilton's speech served a crucial purpose. It staked out the far end of the nationalist spectrum, making the more moderate proposals of Madison and others seem, by comparison, like a reasonable compromise. He continued to participate in the debates, and when the final document began to emerge from the endless process of argument and compromise, he recognized it as a flawed but workable miracle. The new Constitution created a president with significant power, but one who was elected for limited terms. It established a bicameral legislature, balancing the interests of large and small states. It designed an ingenious system of checks and balances to prevent any one branch from becoming too powerful. It was not the government Hamilton had wanted, but it was a government he believed could work. With satisfaction, he became one of the 39 delegates who signed the final document. The battle, however, was far from over. The Constitution was merely a proposal until it was ratified by at least 9 of the 13 states, and the opposition was fierce. A powerful group of opponents, who came to be known as the Anti-Federalists, warned that the new Constitution was a betrayal of the Revolution. Their pamphlets and newspaper essays attacked it as the death of freedom, the birth of a new American tyranny. They claimed the president would become a king, the Senate an oligarchy, and the federal government a monstrous entity that would crush the liberties of the people and the rights of the states. Hamilton knew that these arguments had to be answered, not with speeches, but with calm, reasoned, and overwhelming logic. He decided to launch a public relations campaign of unprecedented scale and intellectual depth. He recruited 2 allies, James Madison, his collaborator at the convention, and John Jay, a respected diplomat from New York. Together, writing under the shared pseudonym Publius, they began to produce a series of essays aimed at the people of New York, a state where ratification was very much in doubt. These essays, which would become known as the Federalist Papers, were a monumental achievement. In a series of 85 articles, they systematically dissected the proposed Constitution, explaining and defending every article, every clause, every intricate mechanism. They were a masterclass in political theory and practical governance. Hamilton was the project's driving force and its most prolific contributor. He wrote an astonishing 51 of the essays himself. He worked at a furious pace, sometimes drafting 2 or 3 essays in a single week, writing by candlelight late into the night while the rest of the city slept, often sending his drafts to the printer with the ink still wet. The Federalist Papers were published in New York newspapers and quickly spread across the country. They were read in taverns, debated in state legislatures, and passed from hand to hand in meeting halls. They transformed the debate. With their powerful logic and clear prose, they turned suspicion into grudging support, and then, in state after state, into the crucial votes needed for ratification. By 1788, the ninth state, New Hampshire, had ratified the Constitution. The United States of America finally had a government worthy of the name, a government with the power to tax, to legislate, to defend itself, and to endure. In 1789, George Washington was unanimously elected the first president of the United States. He understood that his first and most important task was to assemble a cabinet of the most talented men in the country. He needed builders, not just dreamers, men of practical genius, not just high-minded philosophers. For the crucial position of Secretary of the Treasury, the man who would have to build the nation's entire financial system from nothing, he turned to his former aide-de-camp, Alexander Hamilton. The task was Herculean, a challenge that would have broken a lesser man. The nation was, for all intents and purposes, bankrupt. The states were drowning in millions of dollars of war debt. The federal government had no credit, no ability to borrow money at home or abroad. The national currency was a joke. The financial architecture of the country simply did not exist. Hamilton accepted the job with the same relentless, almost terrifying energy he had brought to the battlefield and the ratification debates. He saw the nation's mountain of debt not as a curse, but as a potential tool. In a bold and counterintuitive move, he wrote that a public debt, if not excessive, will be to us a national blessing. His logic was revolutionary. If the new government could prove to the world that it took its financial obligations seriously, that it would pay its promises in full and on time, then lenders would begin to trust it. And that trust public credit was the key. It would allow the nation to borrow money for future needs, to build infrastructure, to fund a navy, to fuel economic growth. Debt, when managed properly, could be the very glue that would bind the new nation together. The foundation was laid. Now, the building could begin. The treasury and the price of a nation. The decade of the 1,790 seconds opened with the United States as a fragile experiment. The new Constitution had given the nation a skeleton, a structure of governance. The immense prestige of President George Washington gave it a sense of dignity and legitimacy. But a nation, like a body, cannot survive on bones and spirit alone. It needs a lifeblood. It needs money. And without a functioning financial system, the grandest republic was nothing more than ink on parchment, a set of noble ideas destined to fail. As the first Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton was tasked with inventing that financial system out of whole cloth. From the moment he stepped into his office in New York City, then the temporary capital, he launched a relentless assault on the chaos of American finance. His capacity for work was legendary. He toiled late into the night, every night, his office lit by the glow of a single candle. Reports, plans, and arguments flowed from his quill pen, page after page, filling with his distinctive handwriting, quick, sharp, and angular, as if it were racing to keep up with the velocity of his thoughts. In January of 1790, just months after taking office, Hamilton submitted his first monumental work to Congress, the Report on Public Credit. It was a bombshell. In it, he laid out a radical and comprehensive plan to solve the nation's debt crisis. The centerpiece of his proposal was that the new federal government should assume, that is, take over all the outstanding debts incurred by the individual states during the Revolutionary War. Furthermore, he insisted that all these debts, both state and federal, should be funded at their full original value. This meant that the government would honor even the old, depreciated war bonds, many of which had been sold for pennies on the dollar by desperate soldiers to wealthy speculators. To Hamilton, this was not merely a matter of bookkeeping. It was a profound statement about the character of the new nation. Credit, he wrote, with the force of an axiom, is the soul of commerce. If America wanted to be taken seriously on the world stage, if it wanted to attract investment and build a modern economy, it had to prove beyond any doubt, that it paid its debts faithfully. By assuming the state debts, the federal government would bind the states more closely to the Union, giving wealthy creditors a direct financial stake in the success of the national experiment. Debt, when handled wisely, would not be a weakness, but a source of strength, a tool to unify the country and fuel its future growth. The plan immediately ignited a firestorm of opposition. Critics howled in protest. The fiercest objections came from the southern states, particularly Virginia, which, through painstaking effort, had already managed to pay off much of its own war debt. Men like James Madison, once Hamilton's close ally in the fight for the Constitution, were now his bitter opponents. Why, the Virginian planters demanded, should their hard-earned tobacco profits be taxed to pay for the debts of profligate New England states like Massachusetts, which had not been so fiscally responsible? It seemed like a reward for irresponsibility. Others, like Thomas Jefferson, were morally outraged by the proposal to fund the old bonds at full value, arguing it would create a corrupt class of speculators who would get rich off the sacrifices of ordinary soldiers. The debate raged in Congress for months, threatening to tear the new government apart before it could even learn to walk. Newspapers fumed, and the fragile unity of the nation seemed ready to crack. Hamilton fought back with everything he had. He wrote essays, he delivered powerful speeches, and he sent a barrage of private letters to congressmen, his arguments in each one sharpened like a blade. He argued passionately that they were all Americans, that the debts were incurred in a common cause, and that they must be paid by the nation as a whole. Unity, he insisted, required trust. Trust required the payment of debts, and the payment of debts required a strong, active federal government. When the deadlock in Congress seemed hopeless, the political battle moved from the public floor to a private dinner table. In a now famous moment of political horse trading, Hamilton sat down with his two chief opponents, Thomas Jefferson, the Secretary of State, and James Madison. Over dinner and wine, the three men hammered out one of the most significant compromises in American history. The deal was a classic exercise in political pragmatism. Jefferson and Madison agreed to stop blocking Hamilton's debt assumption plan and to whip the necessary Southern votes to get it passed in Congress. In return, Hamilton agreed to use his influence to support their passionate desire to move the national capital. The permanent capital would be relocated from the north, first temporarily to Philadelphia, and then permanently to a new federal district to be carved out of land along the Potomac River, the future Washington, D.C. It was a trade of debt for geography, finance for politics. Both sides could claim victory. Jefferson and Madison brought the seat of power south, closer to their agrarian heartland. And Hamilton got the financial system he knew the nation desperately needed to survive. With his first great battle won, Hamilton immediately moved on to the next pillar of his economic architecture, a national bank. In his report on a national bank, he proposed the creation of the Bank of the United States, a powerful public-private institution. This bank would serve as the depository for all government funds. It would issue a stable national currency, and it would regulate credit, providing a much-needed anchor for the nation's chaotic financial markets. Once again, the opposition was immediate and fierce. Thomas Jefferson thundered against the plan, arguing that it was blatantly unconstitutional. He read the Constitution with a strict, literal interpretation. Nowhere, he pointed out, did the document explicitly grant Congress the power to create a corporation like a bank. He warned that the bank would create a dangerous alliance between the government and a wealthy elite of northern merchants and financiers, enriching the few at the expense of the many. It would favor the cities over the countryside, the speculators over the honest farmers, who he believed were the true backbone of the American Republic. Hamilton's response was a work of legal and philosophical genius. He articulated what would become known as the doctrine of implied powers. He argued for a broad, flexible interpretation of the Constitution. While the power to create a bank was not explicitly stated, he contended that it was clearly implied by the powers that were. If the Constitution gave Congress the authority to tax, to borrow money, and to regulate commerce, then it must also grant Congress the power to use the necessary tools to carry out those functions. A national bank, he argued, was a necessary and proper tool for managing the nation's finances. The final decision rested with President Washington. He listened carefully to both sides, weighing the arguments of his two most brilliant cabinet members. In the end, he was persuaded by Hamilton's pragmatic and forward-looking vision. He signed the bank bill into law in February 1791. Within months, the Bank of the United States opened its doors in Philadelphia, and its stock became a hot commodity, a clear sign of the growing confidence in Hamilton's system. The third major piece of Hamilton's plan was to create a reliable stream of revenue to fund the government and pay the interest on the new national debt. To do this, he proposed a series of taxes, including, most controversially, an excise tax on domestically produced whiskey. This tax struck a raw nerve. For farmers on the western frontier of Pennsylvania and Kentucky, whiskey was not a luxury beverage. It was a form of currency and their primary means of getting their surplus grain to market. It was far easier and more profitable to distill corn or rye into spirits and transport it over the Appalachian Mountains than to haul the bulky grain itself. To these fiercely independent frontier farmers, the whiskey tax felt like a direct assault from a distant, powerful government, eerily reminiscent of the British taxes they had just fought a revolution to escape. Anger smoldered and then exploded into open rebellion. In 1794, masked men attacked and terrorized federal tax collectors. Rebel militias formed, marching under banners that echoed the revolutionary cries against tyranny and unjust taxation. The Whiskey Rebellion was the first major test of the new Constitution's authority. Hamilton saw it as a direct challenge to the legitimacy of the federal government, one that had to be met with overwhelming force. He urged President Washington to act decisively. For the first and only time in American history, a sitting president led an army in the field. Washington, with Hamilton at his side, marched at the head of a federalized militia of 13,000 soldiers, an army larger than the one he had often commanded during the Revolution, into western Pennsylvania. The rebellion dissolved in the face of this massive show of force. No major battle was fought. The rebels simply melted away. But the message was clear and unmistakable. The laws passed by the federal government would be enforced. The authority of the Constitution was not a suggestion, it was the supreme law of the land. While the action was a success from Hamilton's perspective, it further damaged his reputation among his growing list of enemies. They painted him as a power-hungry militarist, a man who was all too eager to use armies against his own citizens where persuasion had failed. By the mid-1790 seconds, the political landscape had fractured. The ideological chasm between Hamilton and Jefferson had widened into an unbridgeable gulf. Their disagreements were no longer just policy debates. They were a fundamental battle for the soul of America. Jefferson and his ally James Madison had formally organized their followers into the Democratic Republican Party, dedicated to opposing Hamilton's agenda. In their eyes, Hamilton was a monarchist in disguise, a would-be Caesar who was using his financial system to create a corrupt, British-style government based on banks, armies, and a permanent national debt that would shackle the freedom of the common man. Hamilton and his supporters, who became known as the Federalists, fought back with equal ferocity. Hamilton saw Jefferson's vision of an agrarian republic of small farmers as a naive and dangerous fantasy, a recipe for keeping America weak, poor, and dependent on the whims of European powers. The American two-party system, which the founders had dreaded, had been born, not from careful design, but from a crucible of rage, suspicion, and deeply held conflicting principles. By the time Washington prepared to retire in 1796, Hamilton's work as Treasury Secretary was largely complete. In the space of a few short, tumultuous years, he had built, from scratch, the financial foundations of the United States. The nation now had good credit, a stable currency, a national bank, and a reliable source of revenue. But his success had come at a steep price. The political unity that had been so vital during the Revolution was shattered. The battles ahead would no longer be fought with cannons and muskets, but with pamphlets, political parties, and personal pride. And Hamilton, a man who had never backed down from a fight in his life, would find himself at the very center of storms that were even fiercer than any he had faced on the battlefield. The storms of faction and the final duel. By the mid-1790 seconds, Alexander Hamilton stood at the absolute zenith of his influence, and simultaneously at the very center of a political inferno. He had, through sheer force of will and intellect, erected the entire economic backbone of the United States. He had guided President Washington's administration with a hand that was as steady as it was relentlessly ambitious. But in the zero-sum game of early American politics, every achievement created an equal and opposite reaction. The louder the praise for his accomplishments from his Federalist allies, the fiercer and more vitriolic the opposition grew from his enemies. The leader of that opposition was Thomas Jefferson. Having returned from his diplomatic post in France filled with the romantic rhetoric of revolution and a deeply ingrained suspicion of centralized power, Jefferson looked at the America Hamilton was building and saw a nightmare taking shape. He saw Hamilton's national bank, his federal taxes, and his calls for a professional army not as tools of nation building, but as the insidious architecture of a new monarchy, hidden behind the language of ledgers and finance. Alongside James Madison, his intellectual partner and political strategist, Jefferson methodically built the Democratic-Republican Party, a political machine designed for one primary purpose: to counter and ultimately dismantle the Hamiltonian system. The political warfare that ensued was brutal and deeply personal. Pamphlets flew from the printing presses like poisoned arrows. Rival newspapers, funded by one party or the other, screamed daily headlines of betrayal, corruption, and tyranny. Jefferson's allies, like the sharp-penned journalist Philip Freneau, relentlessly attacked Hamilton in print. They painted him as a would-be Caesar, a man of dangerous ambition who was twisting Washington's honorable trust to consolidate power, enrich his speculator friends, and crown himself the king of a new financial aristocracy. Hamilton, never one to suffer an attack in silence, fired back with his own formidable arsenal of words. Writing under a series of classical pseudonyms like Pacificus and Camillus, he penned essays that blistered the page with their intellectual firepower and personal scorn. He defended the administration's policies, arguing for a strong executive, neutrality in the wars raging in Europe, and the absolute necessity of his economic measures. He ridiculed Jefferson's agrarian dream as a naive and dangerous fantasy, a vision of virtuous yeoman farmers that was utterly blind to the harsh realities of a world governed by power, trade, and money. He accused Jefferson of hypocrisy, a slave-owning aristocrat who preached liberty while living off the forced labor of others. The nation was being torn in two by the conflicting visions of its two most brilliant and most implacable founding fathers. Then, in the midst of this political firestorm, a scandal erupted that threatened to destroy Hamilton completely. For years, his enemies had whispered accusations of financial corruption, suggesting he was using his position as Treasury Secretary to enrich himself and his friends. In 1797, these whispers burst into the open when a muckraking pamphleteer named James Callender published documents that seemed to prove Hamilton had been involved in an illicit financial scheme with a man named James Reynolds, a known speculator and scoundrel. The accusation was that Hamilton had been using government funds to speculate in the market alongside Reynolds. The truth, however, was far stranger, more personal, and in its own way, more destructive. Hamilton had indeed been paying money to James Reynolds, but it was not for financial speculation. It was blackmail. Hamilton had been engaged in a sordid, year-long extramarital affair with Reynolds' wife, Maria. James Reynolds had discovered the affair and had been extorting hush money from Hamilton ever since. Faced with a devastating political choice, allow the charge of public corruption to stand and ruin his entire life's work, or confess to a private moral failing and suffer immense personal humiliation, Hamilton made a decision that was as audacious as it was shocking. He chose to confess. He published a 95-page pamphlet known today as the Reynolds Pamphlet, in which he laid out, in excruciating detail, the entire story of his affair with Maria Reynolds. He included copies of his love letters to her and her letters to him. He did this to prove that the payments to James Reynolds were for blackmail, not illegal speculation. He was choosing to sacrifice his personal honor to protect his public integrity. The pamphlet stunned the nation. The public gasped at the salacious details. His Federalist allies winced in embarrassment. His wife, Eliza, was publicly humiliated and privately devastated. And his Jeffersonian enemies laughed until, as one observer noted, their ink ran dry. They had sought to prove him a corrupt minister, and instead, he had proven himself an adulterer. Hamilton survived the scandal politically he had, after all, cleared his name of the more serious charge of financial misconduct, but the damage to his reputation was permanent. The affair clung to him like smoke, a stain that could never be fully washed away. Through all these storms, both political and personal, Hamilton remained fiercely loyal to one man, George Washington. He continued to be the president's most trusted advisor. When Washington decided to retire after 2 terms, it was Hamilton to whom he turned for help in crafting his final message to the American people. Hamilton drafted much of Washington's celebrated farewell address in 1796, weaving in the president's ideas with his own elegant prose. The address was a profound and prophetic warning against the very dangers Hamilton saw consuming the nation: the poison of excessive factionalism, the perils of permanent foreign entanglements, and the destructive nature of ambition unchained by civic virtue. When Washington retired to Mount Vernon, it was a turning point for Hamilton. The immense shield of Washington's prestige no longer protected him from his enemies or from the worst impulses of his own proud and combative nature. The presidential election of 1800 was one of the most vicious and consequential in American history. It pitted the Federalist incumbent, John Adams, against his own vice president, the Democratic-Republican leader Thomas Jefferson. Hamilton, who had since retired from the Treasury, could not stay out of the fight. He had a deep personal and political dislike for John Adams, viewing him as vain, stubborn, and temperamentally unfit to lead. Yet he loathed Jefferson and his entire political philosophy with every fiber of his being. Trapped between 2 candidates he disdained, Hamilton made a disastrous political miscalculation. He wrote a scathing pamphlet attacking his own party's sitting president, John Adams, intending it for private circulation among Federalist leaders. The pamphlet was inevitably leaked, and it shattered the Federalist Party, all but ensuring a Jeffersonian victory. The election produced a result no one had anticipated. Jefferson ended up in an electoral tie, not with Adams, but with his own running mate, a brilliant, charming, and dangerously ambitious New York politician named Aaron Burr. Under the rules of the day, the tie threw the election into the House of Representatives, which was still controlled by the lame duck Federalists. The Federalists, who despised Jefferson, were tempted to throw their support to Burr, whom they saw as a more malleable, less ideological figure. It was in this moment of crisis that Hamilton made one of the most fateful decisions of his life. He had a long and bitter rivalry with Aaron Burr in New York politics. He saw Burr as a man utterly devoid of principle, a political chameleon driven by nothing but his own insatiable ambition. As much as he hated Jefferson's principles, He believed Jefferson at least had principles. Burr, he feared, had none. Putting his country's stability above his own personal feelings and partisan hatred, Hamilton used his considerable influence within the Federalist Party to swing the vote in the House. He lobbied tirelessly for his arch-nemesis, Jefferson. "Better a man with wrong principles," he wrote in a letter to a Federalist congressman, "than a man with none." After 36 agonizing ballots, the House finally elected Thomas Jefferson as the third president of the United States. Jefferson won the presidency, but Aaron Burr, now relegated to the vice presidency, would never, ever forgive Hamilton for thwarting his ambition. The enmity between Hamilton and Burr continued to fester. In 1804, Burr, having been cast aside by Jefferson, ran for governor of New York, hoping to rebuild his political career. Once again, Hamilton worked tirelessly behind the scenes to ensure his defeat, viewing the prospect of an unprincipled man like Burr leading his home state as a grave danger to the Republic. During the campaign, a newspaper published a letter quoting Hamilton as having expressed a despicable opinion of Burr at a private dinner, calling him a man dangerous to trust with power. For Burr, this was the final insult. His political career was in ruins, and he blamed Hamilton. He seized upon the newspaper report as a matter of personal honor. He sent a formal letter to Hamilton, demanding an apology and a retraction. Hamilton, bound by the rigid code of honor of the era and his own unyielding pride, refused to back down. To apologize, in his view, would be an admission of cowardice. A tense and formal exchange of letters followed, each one more bristling with accusation, defiance, and the rigid language of the Code of Honor. Neither man would yield an inch. In the aristocratic culture of the early Republic, there was only one way such an impasse between two gentlemen could be resolved. In early July of 1804, Aaron Burr formally challenged Alexander Hamilton to a duel. The location was set, the heights of Weehawken, New Jersey, just across the Hudson River from New York City. It was a secluded spot, a narrow ledge on the cliffs that hung above the Gray River, a place that felt like the very edge of the world. It was the same spot where Hamilton's own son, Philip, had been killed in a duel 3 years earlier. In the days leading up to the duel, Hamilton seemed to be a man wrestling with his fate. He put his legal and financial affairs in order. He wrote tender farewell letters to his beloved wife, Eliza, speaking of his deep love for her and their children, his faith in God, and the terrible possibility that he might not return from his journey across the river. In one letter, he hinted at his plan for the duel itself. He wrote that he had resolved, if possible, to throw away his first shot, to fire wide of his opponent as a final, honorable gesture, a way to satisfy the code without taking a life. Burr, meanwhile, was seen in the woods near his home, sharpening his aim. At dawn on the 11th of July, 1804, the two men were rowed across the Hudson in separate boats. The morning was still and hazy. They met on the secluded ledge, with only their seconds as witnesses. The formalities were observed with cold precision. The pistols were loaded. The men took their positions, standing back to back. They paced off the required 10 paces. They turned to face each other, two of the nation's most brilliant men, now mortal enemies, standing just 30 feet apart. The signal was given. 2 shots rang out, the reports echoing across the silent river. Hamilton's shot, true to his word, struck a tree branch high above Burr's head. Burr's shot did not miss. His aim was steady and true. The lead ball struck Hamilton in the abdomen on his right side, fracturing a rib, tearing through his liver and diaphragm, and lodging near his spine. Hamilton collapsed to the ground. The duel was over. They carried him, bleeding and in agony, back across the river to a friend's house in New York. He lingered for 31 torturous hours, drifting in and out of consciousness, surrounded by his devastated family and friends. In his final moments, he spoke of his love for Eliza and their children, and of his fears for the future of the republic he had fought so hard to build. By the afternoon of the 12th of July, 1804, Alexander Hamilton, the orphan from the Caribbean, the hero of the Revolution, the architect of the American financial system, was dead at the age of 47, or perhaps 49. The duel ended his life, but it also destroyed Aaron Burr's. His reputation collapsed, and he would live out the rest of his long life as a political pariah and a wanderer. The Federalist Party, already weakened, began to wither and die. But the systems Hamilton had built, the strength of the Constitution he had defended, the credit of the Treasury he had established, the very financial bones of the nation, these things proved to be stronger than any single man. They outlived him. The duel had ended his life, but it could not and did not end his legacy. The unseen Garden of Legacy, the sharp, clean echo of the pistol shot at Weehawken, faded quickly along the misty banks of the Hudson River on that July morning. But its reverberations, the shock waves of that single moment, would stretch across the decades and centuries that followed. Alexander Hamilton lay dead, struck down before the nation he had helped to create had even reached its 50th birthday. His enemies had won the final, fatal argument. Aaron Burr had vanished into disgrace, and Thomas Jefferson, now president, stood seemingly triumphant, his vision of an agrarian republic, the ascendant political philosophy of the land. Yet the ideas that Hamilton had fought for, the systems he had meticulously designed and defended, did not die with him. The principles he had championed, a strong and energetic central government, a stable and sophisticated financial system, a union bound together by law, ambition, and mutual interest, would not only survive, but would ultimately outlive him, shaping the future of the United States long after his rivals had faded into the pages of history. The first and most devoted guardian of his legacy was his widow, Elizabeth Schuyler Hamilton. After the duel, Eliza lived for another 50 years, a remarkable half-century dedicated to preserving her husband's memory and defending his honor. She wore black for the rest of her long life, a perpetual symbol of her grief. She raised their 7 surviving children alone, managing the family's often precarious finances with a quiet strength. Her most important work, however, was as an archivist and a historian. She painstakingly collected, sorted, and organized Hamilton's voluminous letters and writings, fighting to ensure that his side of the story would not be erased by the growing chorus of Jeffersonian critics and politicians who sought to twist the narrative of the founding for their own partisan gain. Her devotion was not limited to paper and ink. In a profound act of public service that connected directly back to her husband's own origins, she helped to co-found the first private orphanage in New York City, the Orphan Asylum Society. Perhaps in the faces of the city's abandoned children, she saw the lonely, forgotten boy who had once been stranded on a Caribbean island with nothing but his own ferocious talent and a desperate hunger to prove his worth. To those who visited her in her old age, she was a figure of immense and quiet dignity. They recalled the way she spoke of her Alexander, as if he had merely stepped out of the room for a moment and might be expected to return at any time. Through her long vigil, Eliza Hamilton became the first curator of her husband's legacy, ensuring that the flame he had carried would not be extinguished. And indeed, much of what Hamilton had envisioned for America began to take root and flourish long after his death, often in ways that would have surprised his opponents. The sophisticated financial system he had designed, centered on public credit and a national bank, proved to be remarkably resilient. It kept the young nation solvent through the War of 1812, through economic depressions, and through the massive territorial expansions of the 19th century. The very machinery he had built outlived its mechanic. The Constitution, which he had so brilliantly defended in the Federalist Papers, proved to be more than just words on a page. It weathered the storms of secession threats, bitter political conflicts, and ultimately, the cataclysm of the Civil War, emerging stronger and more central to the nation's identity than ever before. And the principle of federal power that he had championed from the very beginning, the idea that the United States must be one nation, indivisible, rather than a loose scattering of quarrelsome states, was the very principle that Abraham Lincoln would invoke to save the Union. In the great ideological battles of American history, Jefferson and his allies had often won the elections, but Hamilton, in the long, slow march of time, had won the future. For decades after his death, Hamilton's reputation ebbed and flowed like the financial markets he had once worked to stabilize. Historians of the Jeffersonian and Jacksonian schools painted him as the great villain of the founding era, an elitist, a monarchist, a man who was too fond of banks, standing armies, and the corrupting influence of executive power. He was cast as the dark, aristocratic foil to Jefferson's bright, democratic hero. But as the 19th century progressed, the reality of America began to look less and less like Jefferson's pastoral utopia, and more like Hamilton's commercial republic. The Industrial Revolution, the westward expansion fueled by canals and railroads, and the bloody crucible of the Civil War all served to slowly but surely vindicate Hamilton's core vision of a strong central government and a dynamic modern economy. When steam engines screamed across the newly carved iron paths over the mountains, and telegraph wires stitched the continent together with words that traveled faster than a horse could run, Americans began to realize that they were living inside the world that Alexander Hamilton had foreseen. The factories that rose in New England, the bustling port cities, the banks that funded the nation's growth. This was the restless, commercial, modern America he had imagined while Jefferson dreamed of farms. When the Union finally cracked in 1861, it was Hamiltonian principles that Abraham Lincoln used to weld it back together. Lincoln wielded federal power with a strength and an authority that Hamilton would have instantly recognized and applauded. He instituted national banks to finance the war, levied wartime taxes, protected the construction of transcontinental railroads, and implemented a military draft to fill the ranks of the Union Army. The Confederacy, in many ways, claimed to be fighting for the Jeffersonian ideals of states' rights, local rule, and the independence of regions from a powerful central authority. But it was Hamilton's vision of a single, indivisible nation, with a federal power that was supreme when its survival was at stake, that ultimately triumphed on the battlefield at Appomattox. Beyond the grand sweep of politics and economics, Hamilton's life story carried a lesson that was perhaps even deeper and more resonant with the nation's evolving identity. He was the quintessential American immigrant, the ultimate outsider who became the ultimate insider. Born in a distant colony, raised in poverty and illegitimacy, denied all the traditional privileges of birth, family fortune, or landed status, he had risen to the very heights of power and influence on the basis of his intellect, his relentless energy, and his sheer, unadulterated audacity alone. His life was a testament to the idea that the new republic could be a place where ability mattered more than ancestry, where raw talent could lift a man higher than any inherited title. In this sense, Hamilton embodied the promise of America just as powerfully as Jefferson's yeoman farmer or Washington's stoic general. By the turn of the 20th century, as skyscrapers began to pierce the clouds above Manhattan and Wall Street's ticker tapes clicked out the rhythm of a new global economy, scholars and historians began to revisit Hamilton with fresh eyes. Biographies began to emerge that cast him not as a scheming aristocrat, but as a brilliant and prescient visionary who understood the forces of markets, institutions, and human ambition far better than most of his peers. They saw him as the true architect of American capitalism and the prophet of its industrial might. His face, which first appeared on the $10 bill in 1929, became a daily tangible presence in the lives of millions of Americans. He had never become president, but of all the founders, only he and Washington shared the unique distinction of being carried in the pockets and passed from hand to hand. His portrait a constant reminder of his role in the creation of the nation's currency and its treasury. This cultural resurrection reached its stunning apex in the 21st century. In 2015, a Broadway musical, simply titled Hamilton, exploded onto the American cultural scene, becoming a global phenomenon. Using the modern language of hip-hop, rap, and R&B, the show told the story of the $10 founding father without a father, the orphan immigrant who wrote and fought and argued his way into the heart of American history. For millions of people, it was the first time that Hamilton felt truly human, not a marble bust in a museum. He was passionate, flawed, brilliant, and defiant, all in the same heartbeat. The man who had once been buried under decades of political propaganda now strode across the stage under the bright lights, his story retold with a rhythm and an energy that he himself would surely have admired. More than 2 centuries after his death, the United States still wrestles with the very questions that Hamilton confronted at its birth. How strong should the federal government be? How much power should the president hold in times of crisis? How do we balance the forces of the free market with the need for regulation? Hamilton offered his own answers, bold, often controversial, and always imperfect. But underlying all his answers was a core belief in energy, in action over drift, in building over just talking, in embracing the future, rather than clinging to a nostalgic vision of the past. Today, on the cliffs above the Hudson River, the wind still moves through the trees in the quiet grove where Alexander Hamilton fell. Below, the city of New York hums and roars, an astonishing empire of commerce and finance, with its banks, its stock exchanges, and its towering skyscrapers of steel and glass, a city that he would have recognized as the heir to his vision. The republic he helped to build continues to argue with itself endlessly, to grow restlessly, and to survive stubbornly. He would not have wanted it to be quiet. In the heart of Lower Manhattan, at Trinity Church, visitors still leave flowers on the weathered stone that marks his final resting place. The city he helped to turn into the financial capital of the world thunders around him. The orphan from Nevis, the boy who dreamed of a world beyond his small island, now lies at the very center of the world he helped to imagine into existence. Legacy, he once wrote in a letter to his wife, is planting seeds in a garden you never get to see. Alexander Hamilton never saw his garden fully bloom. He never saw the railroads span the continent, the skyscrapers touch the clouds, or the nation he built become the most powerful on earth. But we live in that garden still.